Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here to the west of Avdiivka in the direction of Berdyachi, where the Russians have advanced in two separate directions to the north and in the central parts of the town, and the Ukrainians have counterattacked and regained control over the northern flank here in the central parts. However, that section has met its purpose, as the Russians have managed to advance significantly in the central parts, allowing them to gain into the central parts of Berdyachi, where fighting is now reported to arrive at the church and gas station areas, which means that the Russians are trying to push through the central parts, now that the Ukrainians have counterattacked in the northern parts, regaining full control over the central parts. But with the Russians now attacking the southern parts, the Ukrainians are now pressured in both directions. At the same time, the Russians have launched an attack here to the north of Berdyachi. They are likely looking to gain control over the roads here in the northern section to push in a northern direction towards the Ukrainian fortifications in the area. It could simply also be to continue this flanking maneuver, push through the northern parts of Berdyachi, then flank at the next entrance into the central parts. The Russians are now playing a strategy where they keep pushing in the northern section, which is less defended than the central parts, after which they flank their positions, which forces the Ukrainians to redirect its forces to hold back this advance and flanking maneuver to avoid the Russians from cutting off their supply line, which then degrades the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians in the central parts, which subsequently allows the Russians to advance in the southern parts. So there's this constant back and forth between the Russians and the Ukrainians, where the Russians are pushing and trying to outflank the Ukrainian positions, and whenever the Ukrainians respond to that, they push in the central parts. Moving down to the direction of Novomykhailivka, yet again more advances to the north and central parts, this time in the town of Novomykhailivka. The Russians have gained full control over the eastern parts of Novomykhailivka. Fighting continues in the northern parts that is separated by the river line, and with this the Russians would be in a situation where they are looking to push the northern flank of Novomykhailivka. You see in the northern directions the Russians are pushing through two roads, one to the north and one to the east of the town, and both of these connects here to the northern parts, leading down to the Berdyachi area to the north of Novomykhailivka. So the Russians may be looking here to flank the Ukrainian positions by attacking from the north and hitting it from an area where the fighting is not taking place. The Russians managed to gain control over the roads and intersection here to the north and flank the Ukrainian positions in Novomykhailivka. It could strengthen their ability to continue pushing in the northern direction. At the same time, fighting continues in the central parts, where the Russians have managed to successfully cut off the supply road between the northern and central parts, and with this it is likely that the Russians will soon gain control over the northern parts, after which they can push on to the Berdyachi area from the east as well, combining both the northern and eastern directions. The Russians' objective here is to continue forcing the Ukrainians to push their resources towards Novomykhailivka, as they have control over the majority of the fortifications in the area, and with their foothold within the town, whenever the Ukrainians provide reinforcements to counterattack, the Russians are on the defensive, which means that the Russians are trying to gain an advantage by getting a foothold within the town itself, then digging in near the front line. If the Ukrainians launch a counterattack and degrade their forces, then the Russians will take advantage of that to advance a bit further, and then repeating the process. The Russians, while being on the offensive, are switching things around to get on the defensive. In the northern parts, the Russians are here clearly on the offensive, trying to push through. This is where they are having the most difficulty pushing through and gaining advances, but they are doing so nonetheless. The majority of the fighting took place early on in March. This first advances in the central parts took place between the 1st and the 5th, the southern parts between the 4th and the 6th. Then the eastern parts came in on the 11th, then it restarted here on the 20th, and now with the 24th, we see additional advances within the central and northern parts. This means following the recent developments in the west of Avdiivka, which took a lot of attention of the Russian army, other sections of the front line have now restarted the fighting. This is similar to the northern parts by Bakhmut, where fighting took place at the start of the month. Then there was a major gap between the 5th and the 21st, after which the Russians quickly captured Ivanivske. To the north of Klishchiivka and south of Berdyachi, it is a similar case. It seems that the Russians had a 2-week operational pause where they were focusing on defense and holding the positions that they've gained, consolidating them before restarting again a few days ago. Here to the west of Avdiivka, the majority of the fighting took place throughout the whole time without a stop, with the Ukrainians launching constant counterattacks at the start of the month, following by a constant Russian advance, where they've managed to gain full control over Tonenke and Novomykhailivka, and fighting continues in Berdyachi. It is said that the Ukrainians are receiving reinforcements from the northern direction through Novomykhailivka to the north down into Berdyachi, and this is why the Bradley Cemetery was here in the western parts, because they were arriving from the northern direction. In regards to this, the Russians are looking to flank the village itself from the north, trying to gain positions here in the heights and push towards the supply line here to the north of Berdyachi. It is clear that the Ukrainians have been able to hold on to a lot of their possessions here in the north by counterattacking, regaining some of their fortified positions, and pushing the Russian backs after they advanced further to gain further control over the areas here to the north. With that, they had secured the supply line to Berdyachi. We may see a restart of operations by the Russians through the railways to push here to the west of the railways to cut off the supplies through Berdyachi by gaining control over the fortifications here in the forest line. Other than that, we may also see in the northern direction to secure the northern flank and gain control over this intersection here by the railways. The Russians are looking to put pressure on the Ukrainian supply lines due to them being unable to push through the Ukrainian fortifications in Berdyachi. We're seeing that the Ukrainian defenders here are constantly holding their positions and launching counterattacks and ambushes to prevent Russian advances in the area. This has made it very difficult for the Russians to advance in the northern section of the front line. Despite the advances in the central and southern parts, we see that the advances increase the further south you go and decreases the further north you go. And with that, we see that the main focus of the Russians is to hold their positions here in the southern parts now that they've reached the river line, to then redirect their forces to the northern part, where they're looking to push further and gain control over the Ukrainian defensive line. And this is why we may see a restart of operations here to the north, where they'll be looking to put pressure on the Ukrainian supply line to weaken the Ukrainian defenses within Berdyachi and push through to gain control of Berdyachi and Novomykhailivka. Throughout the rest of the front line, there's a bunch of positional fighting, but no serious offensive operations. This means that the main fighting is taking place in the Donetsk region itself, between Bakhmut and the southern parts to Novomykhailivka. This means the majority of the fighting is taking place in this section of the front line, where we see numerous Russian advances every day pushing through the Ukrainian fortifications and defenses. In regards to the Russian missile attacks, another one took place this night. Although it wasn't the major one that we expected, it was still a very big one, which hit further locations in the Ukrainian energy sector. But most importantly, it hit multiple locations in Kiev. These locations included, according to Russian sources, 2 Patriot systems being destroyed and an SBU command center being hit. The SBU command center was reported by open Russian sources to be unknown target, but by the Ukrainian Kiev post we see here, Security Service of Ukraine target of ballistic attack on Kiev, according to the SBU. So we're seeing that the SBU centers in Kiev were hit on top of airfields in which Patriot systems were operating. This means that there's further degradation of the Ukrainian air defense, and this is while the Russians are already reporting that there are numerous gaps in the Ukrainian air defense due to the losses and lack of ammunition that they have suffered throughout these months since they first received them. We're seeing that the missile war is entering into a new phase, similarly to the front war, where the Ukrainians are simply lacking in everything and is having a very difficult time replenishing their resources, both in terms of personnel and equipment. And with that, we see that the war will enter a new stage following these developments. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.